So basically, if you go by the Philippines GDP growth performance, prior to the Duterte administration, we can see that versus regional peers, which are the ASEAN five countries, basically we've been growing in lockstep with them, with the ASEAN five economies, except that while we over while we outperform the other economy, we outperform the average during the Pinoy administration. We can characterize the outperformance to be narrow, shallow, and hollow. So narrow in the sense that capital formation is only concentrated in a few industries and regions. So it's not nationwide. It's not as broad as we want it to be. Shallow in the sense that very little domestic value is added to industrial products, and therefore basically it limits the growth potential. And lastly, hollow, because while the economy is growing, we also see that there's still high unemployment and poverty. So this prompted, next slide please, this prompted the government to basically propose several strategic and structural reforms, including tax reform measures such as TRAIN, series of sin tax reforms and tax amnesty. We've also proposed the enactment of fiscally responsible stimulus bills during the COVID pandemic, and these are Bayanihan 1 and Bayanihan 2. We say fiscally responsible because we it was not our intention to propose social welfare or social assistance bigger than what will help us tide us by. So in other countries, we saw that basically stimulus laws enacted in other countries were excessive and thereby resulted in inflation post-pandemic. So in our country, we see that inflation is less benign compared to more advanced countries such as the United States. Third, basically, we've also proposed the approval of structural reforms and the liberalization of certain industries. So the critical amendments are the amendments to the Retail Trade Liberalization Act, the Foreign Investment Act, and the Public Service Act. So as you know, basically the Public Service Act is a 1930s vintage legislation, which basically has left us in the era of nationalized industries. But by virtue of the recent amendments, we expect more foreign direct investments to come in, especially in certain sectors which were previously treated as public utilities. Next slide. So for the tax reform packages, we see that basically, okay. So basically this table or this schedule shows us the revenue performance and tax performance of the government during the GMA administration, the Pinoy administration, and the Duterte administration. So number one point is we see that in terms of revenue effort, the revenue effort of the Philippines in the last 20 years tops at around 16%. So we've reached this in 2019 during the Duterte administration. A close second was during 2006 to 2007.
Yusek Joven, na-mute po
We
kayo.
lost you.
Yeah, na-mute kayo.
Okay.
Can you say the
yeah.
20 seconds?
So we see that in terms of revenue effort or revenue versus GDP, we see that basically we've reached peak revenue effort in 2019. So but this is not the most telling point here. The more important point here is tax effort. So we see that during the Duterte administration, tax effort has increased significantly in 2019, and even during the pandemic years 2020 and 2021, we see that revenue effort did not fall significantly compared to earlier financial crisis like the Asian financial crisis and the subprime crisis. If you look at this table, tax effort usually falls during a crisis, like as can be seen during the AFC, which is basically 97 to 2004, and during the aftermath of the global financial crisis. So after 2008, moving forward until 2010, 2011. So here we can see that there's minimal slippage in terms of tax effort. So we can attribute this to the structural reforms imposed on our tax system. So we've shifted from a predominantly income-based taxation system to a more consumption-based taxation system. This essentially makes it more efficient to collect taxes. This is disregarding all the media or all the media blitz or media hype carried out by our revenue generating agencies, the BIR and DOC. So we can see that essentially it's not a function of a shame campaign by which we improve tax efforts. It's really by way of making the tax system more efficient. So this is what we've done, and we're more or less at this level, 14% tax effort. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so we can see that basically, this just reiterates the point that both tax effort and revenue effort climbed during the Duterte administration with very little slippage during the pandemic. So we hope to continue these improvements post Duterte administration, because most of the reforms are structural in nature and long term. So we don't expect any backpedaling insofar as this is concerned. Next slide, please. Okay, so now infrastructure spending. So we see that prior to the Duterte administration, infrastructure spending was at a low of around 3% over the long run, over the last 20 years. But during the Duterte administration, we managed to ratchet it up to around 5% of GDP. And prior to the pandemic, we can see that basically 2% of this 2% of this ratchet up in infrastructure spending is supported by internally generated funds or revenues. That's why we maintain a deficit of around 3% of GDP. But with the COVID pandemic, we see that there's a drastic increase in pandemic-related expenditures while we still maintain the 5% infrastructure spending. So this resulted in an increase in the deficit to around 7 to 8%. So hopefully moving forward with the normalization of revenues, number one. Number two, with the steady growth, with the expected steady growth of the Philippine economy, we see that the deficit will go back to normal. So basically, we go back from the pandemic 8% to around lower than 5%. Our ideal here is to reach deficit at around deficit of to GDP of around 3 to 5% post pandemic. So this will make us this will effectively help us resolve the higher debt levels that we have. So next slide, please. So yeah, so this slide shows us basically nominal debt, total nominal debt, and total debt to GDP. So we see that there's a drastic increase in debt to GDP by virtue of two things. Number one, in 2020 specifically, we saw that basically there was a significant closure of business caused by a lockdown, and therefore the financing gap or the gap needs to be financed through loans. So I think that's a necessary evil. But how do we mitigate this necessary evil? Essentially, we localize our borrowing. So we've managed to minimize foreign borrowing to around 25 to 30% of total gross borrowing per year. What does this mean? This means that even if the peso depreciates, in the way it did during the Asian financial crisis, we will not see a significant worsening of the debt stock, because foreign debt comprises, I think, 30% or less than 30% of total debt stock. So even with a depreciation, we minimize that risk. Number two, basically, we try to maintain nominal external debt at the level of lower than GIR, gross international reserve. So essentially, we stabilize our economy by ensuring that the total GIR is bigger than the total external debt, including both private and public external debt. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So this basically shows us the average GDP growth in all the major ASEAN economies versus the Philippines. We see that in 2020, because of the more draconian lockdown that we've experienced, there's a significant drop in the performance of the Philippine economy. But in 2021 and 2022, I think we can see that there's a better than average improvement in GDP growth insofar as the Philippine economy is concerned. So now the key is, how do you maintain this growth in the future, in the next 5 to 10 years? Next slide, please. Okay, so basically, as explained by Professor David earlier, better vaccination creates this wall of protection, and therefore prevents us from sliding back to a situation similar to January 2022. Moving forward, we'd like to maintain this very low level of infection and transmission, in order for the economy not to do a start-stop. Gusto natin, we move forward regardless of what the situation is, and we can only do this by virtue of a very broad vaccination program, which we've done. Next slide, please. Other problem is, of course, climate change. So basically, Philippines is one of the 20 most vulnerable countries in the world in terms of climate disasters. Increasingly, more money should be provided to support disaster resilience. Hence, we've shifted financing, or we've secured ESG financing recently, 2 ESG issuance recently. So number one is a US dollar ROP, which has ESG features, and a samurai ESG issuance. I think it was in March. So in the future, this has several benefits. In the future, we see that there would be more ESG prints, because with the increasing benchmark rates, especially for the US dollar, we would need to use this ESG feature essentially to lower our financing costs or borrowing costs. And of course, to bulk up our order book, so that we can have either a bigger print or a lower yield. So that's all. Thank you.